Let's talk about intestate succession. What is that? Intestate succession is the legal term for who inherits your property if you don't have any heirs named. So let's say you pass away and you don't have a will or a trust. You haven't said who gets your stuff. That brings you to intestate succession. So the law lays out the order that people in your family inherit if you haven't named where you want your assets to go. So this is how people inherit from a long lost uncle they never knew they had. In general, if you passed away and you don't have kids or a spouse, your assets go to your parents. If you don't have parents, they go to siblings. If you don't have siblings, they go down to nieces and nephews. Then they go back up to your grandparents' line and down their lines. Now, a lot of people think that their spouse gets everything if they don't have a will, but that's not entirely true depending on how you own the property. Under intestate succession, we have to determine whether the property at issue is community property or separate property. California is a community property state, which means that if you're married, every dollar you earn, the minute you earn it, 50 cents immediately belongs to your spouse. Separate property is any property that you bring to the marriage and keep separate, or that you inherit or are gifted during the marriage. So separate property is your own property, doesn't have to be divided, and if you get divorced, you get to keep it. So if you pass away and you haven't named who your heirs are, your community property goes to your spouse. If you don't have a spouse, your community property will go to your kids. The reason you wouldn't have a spouse to leave anything to when you die in a community property state is because your spouse passed away with you. Now, for separate property, it's treated a little bit differently. If you're married and you have one child, then your spouse will receive 50% of your separate property and your child will receive 50% of your separate property. If you have more than one child, then your spouse will receive 1/3 of the separate property and the rest of the separate property will be divided equally among the rest of the children. This would also be true if you had children that predeceased you and then had grandchildren. The grandchildren would share in the separate property in the same way that the kids would. So intestate succession is pretty straightforward, but it may not leave your assets where you want them to go. It's important to name who you want your heirs to be. You want to direct where your assets go. If you don't, they go by intestate succession. So, kind of a complicated topic, but also sort of simple. If you'd like to chat about it, I'm happy to. Give me a call.